targeted? And how would you decide whom to target? And in the event that you are carrying out a strike using lethal force of this magnitude on American soil against an American citizen, what kind of criteria would govern your judgment about the risks that would be imposed on innocent people who are in the vicinity? And what about any judicial review at all? Would there be any appropriate role for, because of course we have a very long tradition of a due process. You know, there are a lot of Americans who have serious reservations about the idea of indefinite detention on American soil. Indefinite detention is pretty tame compared to being destroyed by a drone. So I would just suggest that the failure of the administration to answer this basic question of whether or not they believe they've got the authority to do something that's completely unprecedented is a very fundamental and important question and completely legitimate. And it is completely appropriate, I think, for this body to insist on an answer to this question before we would go ahead and confirm a person who would have enormous power and authority over a variety of national security issues. So I just want to commend the senator from Kentucky for really putting a bright light on this issue. This is a very important issue, and as I mentioned earlier, he's done it at great personal inconvenience to himself because he has a passionate commitment to the liberty of the American citizens. He manifests that all the time in many ways, and this is one of the ways that he's doing it, and I commend him for that. And I would just conclude my question by addressing the senator, well, through Madam President, my question for the senator is, has there been any change in the status of a lack of response from the administration since the last time we have heard from the administration?
Madam President, we have been asking the question to the White House all day, and we've said all along that we would allow the vote to proceed forward, but we haven't gotten any response from the White House. And the consideration of whether or not we will get a response tonight, I think it's unlikely. We will still keep pressing the issue in the morning as well. But with regard to the senator's remarks, I think one of the things that I hope that will come out of this debate will be that we will reassert our authority as a function of the separation of powers, where our body will say to the President, we not only would like your drone memos on how you think you can do this, but really we should reassert our authority and tell to the President, this is how we think you should do it, and this is the law that's going to dictate and circumscribe how you will do this. That's an authority that I think has been long necessary, and we've been letting go by the side, and I think we should reassert. At this time, Madam President, I'd like to yield for
a question. Will the senator yield for a question?
Without relinquishing the floor, I'll yield for a question.
I thank the senator from Kentucky, and I apologize to my friend from Wisconsin. I know he's been waiting. But the question asked by the senator from Pennsylvania really prompted me to recall a specific set of circumstances which I think address his concerns, our mutual concerns, about the use of lethal force. I know that we're talking about this in the context of drones, but a drone is a weapon, and there are other weapons by which our government can use lethal force to kill people. So I think, going to the question that you asked, Mr. Brennan, in a more generic sense, the question is, when can our government use lethal force in the United States against perhaps U.S. citizens? And I think it's a legitimate question, and I was not misleading the senator earlier when I said there's a scheduled hearing, the only scheduled hearing on this question coming up before the Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitution, which I chair, and the ranking member, Senator CRUZ of Texas, who was here earlier. So I think it's important, and it's an important constitutional question, but I'd just like to say, while the gentleman, my colleague from Pennsylvania, is here, I'd like to recount a set of circumstances for him and then pose a question to you. The circumstances were 9/11/2001. Some of us were in this Capitol building, in fact, just outside this door. And as we came to work, we heard that some plane had crashed into the World Trade Center in New York. As we were watching on television, a few minutes after 9, a second plane crashed into the World Trade Center. the adjoining building. We all know what happened following that. And as we were in our meeting here, just a few feet away, we started seeing black billowing smoke coming across the mall right outside our window here. A third plane, taken over by these terrorists, was crashing into the Pentagon. What we didn't know at the time was there was a fourth plane. But we evacuated the Capitol, and all of us, literally everyone, raced out of this building to stand on the lawn outside. It wasn't a safe place, but we didn't know where to go. All the tourists, all the staff, and all the rest. It wasn't a few minutes we were out there, and we heard something that sounded like a shot, a discharge of a weapon. In fact, it was fighter planes that were being scrambled to protect the United States Capitol. At that time, the order had gone out to all commercial airplanes in the United States, land immediately, so that we would know who was in our airspace and not responding to that command. It turns out there was one fourth plane involved, and that plane crashed in Pennsylvania, we believe because of the heroism and bravery of the passengers on board, who, when they realized what was happening, tried to take control of that plane before it could be used as a weapon. Many people believe that plane was aimed for this building or for some place in Washington, D.C. We had scrambled our military planes, and had that plane not crashed into the countryside in Pennsylvania and come within the airspace of this Capitol, I think we know what would have happened. Our government would have used lethal force, military lethal force, to shoot down a civilian airplane that was threatening, we believe, threatening the lives of innocent Americans. It would have been the use of lethal force on our soil to stop a person or persons whom we believed were terrorists about to kill innocent Americans. So when I listened to the response from Attorney General Holder in hypothetical and put it in the context of 9/11, I can imagine that President Bush might have been called on in an instant to make a decision as Commander-in-Chief to bring down the fourth plane before it crashed into another building and killed innocent people. Now that's a circumstance, I'd say to the Senator from Pennsylvania and the Senator from Kentucky, which I fully understand and expect the Commander-in-Chief to respond to. So I don't think this is such a clear and easy situation. It's important that we have this hearing and explore the many possibilities. The possibility of a terrorist overseas who threatens our safety and the use of lethal force, drones or otherwise. The possibility of a non-U.S. terrorist in the United States and the use of lethal force to deter them. And then obvious questions, what if it's a U.S. citizen overseas? What if it's a U.S. citizen in the United States? I've joined 10 other senators asking for the same legal memos, which I think you would like to see as well, justifying whatever course of action this administration has used. I think it is a legitimate constitutional responsibility of the Senate and the House and this Congress. But I also understand, having lived through, as all of us did in some respect, 9/11, the complexity of those decisions that have to be made in such a fashion. So my question to you, as I said before, we have to end with a question mark. Don't you consider the situation in 9/11 and the use of lethal force, even military force, to shoot down a civilian plane, if it had survived the passenger effort in Pennsylvania and was headed for the U.S. Capitol, to be a legitimate exercise of a commander-in-chief to protect the United States?
Madam President, absolutely. My answer to the question that the senator raises is absolutely. We have the right to defend ourselves, and it would have been a decision that has to be made imminently because a lethal threat needs to have a lethal response immediately. My whole problem with this whole debate is none of us disagree with that, I don't think. We all agree that you can repel an imminent attack. We all agree if someone is outside the Capitol with a rocket launcher or a grenade launcher, lethal force can be used against them. None of us disagree on that. We're talking about a targeted drone program where we target individuals. Overseas, the standard seems to include people who are not actively engaged in combat, who we think either might be in the future or have been in the past. I don't think that standard can be used in the United States. I think when you're in a battlefield, you don't get due process. If you're shooting at Americans, drones can hit you anytime, missiles can hit you. There is no due process in a battle. This is a big debate because many have said the battlefield is here, but if the battlefield is here, then that would imply that the Fifth Amendment doesn't apply here. The President has said he will use the Fifth Amendment in the process of deciding drone attacks overseas, but he doesn't get the option to kind of use it privately. Using the Fifth Amendment privately, to me, is not really using the Fifth Amendment. I will say I have a great deal of respect for the senator from Illinois. We've often been on the same side on civil liberties issues. I don't question that you and I may well see eye to eye on this issue, that targeted killings of people in restaurants, in their house, in a hotel, is not something that we can or will tolerate. It contravenes the Constitution. It's a simple question. The President should just simply answer that question. I think Attorney General Holder was coming in the direction of that, but why is it so hard? Why is it like pulling teeth to get them to admit that they don't have this power? Presidents need to more easily say, by golly, no, the Constitution says you can't do that. The Fifth Amendment does apply. There are no exceptions to the Fifth Amendment for American citizens on American soil. That's all we're asking. But I think the 9/11 comparison or Pearl Harbor is a red herring in the sense that none of us disagree with repelling a lethal attack, an imminent lethal attack, an ongoing lethal attack with lethal force. No one disagrees with that.
Further for a question, without yielding the floor?
Yes.
The white paper that's been presented to us by the Justice Department concludes that the right to national self-defense and the 2001 authorization to use military force gave the U.S. government legal authority to kill a U.S. citizen in a foreign country that is not an area of active hostilities. If the target is a senior operational leader of al-Qaeda or an associated force, so it's qualified in that regard, the white paper argues such an attack does not violate the constitutional rights of a U.S. citizen. In this circumstance, quote, if he poses an imminent threat of violent attack against the United States, imminent threat. Number two, his capture is not feasible. And the Justice Department white paper goes on to say, and the operation complies with law of war principles, such as the need to minimize collateral damage. I will say to the senator, I stand with him. I want an answer to his question, and I think we should pursue it on a bipartisan basis, as we have many issues together in the past. I think it is a legitimate question, but I would say that the white paper that we've been given relative to this U.S. citizen overseas has some fairly narrow circumstances in terms of the use of force. When it comes to the use of that force in the United States, I believe the circumstances should be just as narrow, if not more. And I would just say to the senator, I am genuine in my concern of bringing these issues out in a full hearing of our Constitution Subcommittee. And I think I have to end the question, and I hope he appreciates my sincerity.
Madam President, in very quick response to that, one of the few problems with that is that they also go on to say that imminent doesn't need to be immediate. You're also implying that you can kill this American citizen in a non-combat situation, not an active battlefield. I don't accept that standard for the United States. It's another debate whether we accept the standard overseas, and I think an important debate, but the debate about whether that's a sufficient standard for America, it's not. To kill someone not in combat, it's not wise. You're not going to get any information. When someone's eating dinner, why don't you send the police over and arrest them? To kill someone who's in a non-combat situation in America is unacceptable under any circumstances, and I think we need to come to an agreement on that. Madam President, I'd like to yield for a question from the senator from Wisconsin.
Senator from Kentucky, obviously all of us have come down here to support, I think, your very legitimate request to have a legitimate question answered. I think you deserve those answers, and if not an answer from the White House, you at least deserve a vote. I started watching you here this morning. What you started by 11:57. It's now past midnight, and I think my primary reaction is one of just being puzzled. I've been here for 2 years, never served in any kind of legislative body. Certainly came to the United States Senate thinking this was the world's greatest deliberative body. And what I found is a body that's just utterly dysfunctional. And even though this is actually one of the best examples of how this body ought to work, it's also an example of that dysfunction. I mean, I cannot believe that this issue has not been resolved within a half hour, within an hour. Just take a vote. You know, we have a number of our colleagues from the House coming here in support of the senator from Kentucky. The House is operating, I believe, as our founders intended. They are passing budgets. They're debating issues. They're passing real pieces of legislation that unfortunately are being dropped over here in the United States Senate, where those good pieces of legislation is dying. And that's a real shame. You know, for example, I serve on the Budget Committee of the United States Senate. I've been on that Budget Committee for 2 years. We have not yet voted on a budget in the Budget Committee. And this is, by the way, when this nation is facing a fiscal crisis unlike anything we've really faced in our history. We've racked up 4 years now where our debt exceeds $1 trillion. There's really no end in sight of that. We haven't even brought to the floor an appropriations bill all year long. How can we function as a body if this is how it operates? Now, a number of Republican senators joined the president at his invitation, his gracious invitation for dinner tonight. It was an excellent dinner. It was a genuine, sincere, open discussion of the fiscal problems facing this nation. Now, I was part of a group of 44 senators a year and a half ago, almost 2 years now, that also joined the president prior to the final debate on the first debt ceiling in the summer of 2011. The President of the United States leaving that meeting should have come away with a very strong understanding that those 44 Republican senators were incredibly sincere in their desire to work with the President, to work with our colleagues across the aisle, to solve these problems. I'll tell you, I'm one United States Senator that ran for office not to become a United States Senator, but because we're losing this country. We're bankrupting it. You know, one of the things when I'm talking around the country, I do make the point that fortunately, I don't know of any parent that would willingly max out their credit cards, get in debt way over their heads, never intending ever to pay it off, but fully intending to pass it off to their children and grandchildren. I don't know any parent that way, fortunately. But yet, collectively as a society, that is exactly what we are doing. You know, frequently in this political town, Republicans are accused of waging a war on women, waging a war on immigrants. None of that is true. What Washington is doing is we're waging a war on our children. We're mortgaging their future. It's absolutely immoral. Americans have got to stop and consider what it is we're actually doing to the future generations. So I certainly left the president, or the dinner with the president tonight. I think all of my colleagues did. I hope the president did. With this pretty strong sense, once again, that there's a great deal of sincerity, a great deal of desire to roll up our shirt sleeves, put down partisan bickering, put down partisan differences, work together to really solve this problem. I think there's got to be a realization that, you know, neither side's going away. If we're going to start solving these problems, we have got to start working together. We have got to return the United States Senate into that deliberative body that our founders intended it to be. We've got to be willing to be held accountable. We've got to take votes. It shouldn't be that hard. We shouldn't be afraid. Now, I'd ask the senator from Kentucky, I mean, as I understand this, again, just puzzling that we're here now after midnight. And again, I just applaud you for your resolve here. And that's why you see every member coming down here and providing the support. But I think all you wanted was either unanimous consent or possibly a vote on this simple question. Resolved, that is the sense of the Senate that, 1, the use of drones to execute or to target American citizens on American soil who pose no imminent threat clearly violates the constitutional due process rights of citizens? Seems like a pretty simple question. Seems like one that most United States senators would want to express their opinion by taking a vote or allowing this resolution to pass by unanimous consent. So I guess my only question is that really all you're looking for? Either an answer from the White House or just a simple unanimous consent agreement or a simple vote?
President, I thank you for the question from the senator from Wisconsin. And yes, we had two simple requests tonight. The first was for a vote on a non-binding resolution to express our opinion that it's unconstitutional to kill Americans on American soil, and that was denied by the majority party. The second request we've had in communication with the White House is for the White House to say or clarify their opinion that they're not going to be doing targeted drone strikes on non-combatants in America. We haven't had much success with either one. We will continue to ask that question. I've told them that I will remove myself from the blockage of John Brennan's nomination as soon as we get some clarification from the White House. I'm still hopeful in the morning that they will do that, and by doing that we can move forward with it. But I've been more than willing to compromise because I don't think it's so much about John Brennan as it is about a constitutional principle. But I want the President to publicly acknowledge that the Fifth Amendment does apply to Americans in our country, and that we're not going to cherry pick when we apply the Fifth Amendment. Madam President, at this time I'd like to yield for a question from the senator from South Carolina.
Thank you. Will the senator from Kentucky yield for a question?
Yes.
Thank you. The drone issue is not an issue. It's not a question about Democrats versus Republicans or the DNC versus the GOP. It's not a question about the executive branch versus the legislative branch. It's not a question about conservatives versus liberals. It's a question about the Constitution. Another one of our friends said that this nation, our great nation, needs to stand and recognize what Rand Paul is doing today for Americans. All of our aspirations mean nothing, nothing at all, without our rights. Another said that you don't have to like our political party. You don't even have to like Senator Rand Paul to stand with Rand. You only need to be against the assassination of Americans without due process on U.S. soil. And so I will close with the question that we've heard many times already. Why will not this administration simply state that it is unconstitutional and illegal, unconstitutional and illegal for the government to kill Americans in the U.S., or said on our soil, or as I think about it, it's illegal on the soil of Greenville, South Carolina. It's illegal in Oconee County, South Carolina. It's illegal in Charleston, South Carolina. It's illegal throughout the coast of South Carolina without due process to kill an American citizen. Is that what you're asking?
Madam President, I think it's an easy question to have answered, and it boggles my mind that they haven't. I think the President in general, though, and other presidents in general, are very, they hang on to their power with a tenacious grip, and they don't want to allow that there's any possibility that by saying they don't have this power that they've given up some power. I think that's a mistake for presidents. I think it goes against what the candidate Barack Obama was for and the Senator Barack Obama. And I hope that in the morning when they wake up, they'll wake up and think about what candidate Barack Obama said in 2007, what Senator Barack Obama once stood for as a senator, and that is that the power of the presidency is limited and checked by the Constitution. Madam President, at this time I'd like to yield for a question from the senator from Arizona.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I want to commend the gentleman for this 12-hour-long quest, I think it is now. It's an important topic. I recently traveled to Afghanistan and received a briefing there about the drone program and how it's working in Afghanistan. And after seeing that briefing, seeing examples of how it's being used, I have to tell you, I was awed by it. I thought, what a powerful weapon, what a great weapon, in this case, to use against terrorists. But my second thought is, what happens when that's in the hands of our enemy? And I can tell you, it's a sobering thought to think of what happens when our enemies get this kind of technology. But it's also sobering to think of what can happen if we use this technology here domestically. So I think that the question you've asked is totally right and proper. At what point or where does the President derive authority, or does he believe he has the authority to use these weapons, or any kind of weapon, for lethal means when there is no imminent threat? So I think that the question that the gentleman is asking, if I understand the question correctly, is right and proper. My understanding is all you want to find out is, does the President believe that the administration has the authority to use lethal means in this manner domestically? Is that correct?
Madam President, that is correct. It's a simple question. I think we're not asking for any heavy lifting here. We're asking the President, you know, do you have this authority? And I think it's important that it is a legal question in the sense that we want to ask and get a legal constitutional response. We're not asking, oh, we probably won't do it, we don't intend to do it, or it's not appropriate, or it's not, as a policy matter, we don't like doing it. We want the constitutional answer. Do you really believe you have the constitutional authority to do this?
Thank you, gentlemen.
Madam President, at this point I would like to recognize for a question, without yielding the floor, the senator from Utah.
A question that I have with regard to an issue that was raised by my friend a few minutes ago. My friend, my distinguished colleague, the senior senator from Illinois, touches upon an important point. Upon a principle of law that dates back centuries and has application in myriad contexts, one that deals with the concept of imminence. So my friend from Illinois is certainly correct in pointing out that the white paper leaked by the Obama Department of Justice to the news media recently does include some analysis that talks about imminence. It is significant, however, to point out that on page 7 of that white paper, the administration goes on to essentially eviscerate that concept of imminence. In fact, it makes clear that this condition, that is the condition dealing with imminence, with the idea of presenting an imminent threat of violent attack against the United States, quote, does not require the United States, under this standard, to have clear evidence that a specific attack on U.S. persons and interests will take place in the immediate future, close quote. That's at the top of the first full paragraph on page 7 of the very same white paper that my friend from Illinois was quoting. And so in response to that question, it is important to point out that they've taken the imminence out of imminent. There is no more imminence in this standard. And so if, in fact, we're to believe the white paper is the correct assessment of the administration's position, it is no longer an imminent standard. It is something else. It's something of a new development. It's something that was created out of whole cloth by this administration that has nothing to do with the traditional imminent standard. So I ask my friend, my colleague, Madam President, my friend from Kentucky, whether this is consistent with time-honored notions of due process.
Madam President, this is exactly what I understand, and it's a significant problem. And I would be happy to yield if there's a question from across the aisle, or a question that is in the form of an explanation as well on his understanding if we understand this incorrectly. But this is a real problem, because the idea of imminence people think of is someone leveling a weapon at you, you're in a battlefield, all of these things of which none of us disagree that there should be a response. But the problem is, I mean, it really is, and this is, you know, I'm not an attorney, so it's easy for me to disparage attorneys, even though I'm standing among two that I admire, or more probably. But But the whole point is that that sounds like a bunch of government attorneys got together and tried to write some gobbledygook that no one could understand, that makes no sense, that imminence now means something that's not immediate. I'd be happy to entertain a question or without yielding the floor.
This is getting perilously close to a debate, and I'm sorry for those who are observing it if it looks like a Senate is actually in debate. But an obvious question, was Osama bin Laden an imminent threat to the United States when we took him out? I think he was. Was he hatching a plot to cause harm to the United States in an imminent manner? Probably not.
Madam President, I would say touche. Good response, and I think well worth thinking about. And difficult in the sense that I don't think there's any of us who really were opposed to getting bin Laden. And there's a question, you're right, of whether or not exactly there was imminence involved with that. And I think, though, that when we start talking about standards, whether we have standards in battlefield, standards overseas, and standards at home, I think the standard at home has to be incredibly high. And I don't believe that we're involved in a battlefield here. I don't believe that you have given up due process here. I don't know that bin Laden had any due process. And I would yield for a question from the senator from Texas.
I thank the senator from Kentucky, and I would point out that the questions of imminence I don't think are nearly as difficult as has been suggested. And indeed, I'd like to thank the senior senator from Illinois for braving this long evening and for expressing his equal and heartfelt concerns about the limitations on the power of the executive to take the lives of U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. I would point out that at the hearing we had now yesterday with the Attorney General, there was a series of questions exploring in further depth what the position of this administration was. Because in response to the senator from Kentucky's inquiry, Attorney General Holder put in writing that he could imagine circumstances in which it would be permissible to take the lives of U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. And the two examples he gave were Pearl Harbor and 9/11. And as the senator for Kentucky responded, and I think everyone here agrees, those examples are unobjectionable. Both of those instances were instances of grievous military attacks. I think nobody doubts that if kamikaze planes are coming down on our ships in Pearl Harbor, that the United States can use lethal force to take out those planes and to save the lives of our servicemen and women. There's no question about that, legal or otherwise. Likewise, I think nobody doubts that if terrorists have taken over an airliner and are steering it into a building, that as tragic as that decision would be, as heart-wrenching as the decision on 9/11 must have been for the president to give the order to shoot down that fourth commercial airline if it began approaching yet another target where it could inflict thousands of deaths. I think nobody disputes that stopping an imminent, immediate act of violence, and indeed a military act of war, is fully within the authority of the federal government. The question that was posed of the Attorney General was the question that Senator Paul had asked originally, not that question. Rather, it was, if there is an individual, a U.S. citizen, on U.S. soil who is suspected of being a terrorist and for whom we can say, arguendo, there is abundant evidence to demonstrate this individual is a terrorist. And if this individual is on U.S. soil and is not currently an imminent threat of violence, if he or she is sitting at a cafe in rural Virginia having a cup of coffee, the question that I pose to the Attorney General is, in those circumstances, would it be constitutional for the United States government to send a drone to kill that U.S. citizen on U.S. soil with no due process of law if that individual did not pose an imminent threat. Now, in my judgment, that was not a difficult question. I think the answer, frankly, the answer I expected was of course not. Of course the federal government cannot kill a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil who does not pose an imminent threat. That's been the state of the law from the day our Constitution came into effect and from before. Instead, the first response of the Attorney General was, well, it wouldn't be appropriate to use lethal force there, and we wouldn't do so. And I pressed again to the Attorney General and said, with respect, the question is not whether it is appropriate or not. It's not a question of prosecutorial discretion. Do we trust that you would not choose to exercise lethal force in that circumstances? Rather, it is a question, would it be constitutional to kill a United States citizen on U.S. soil with a drone if that individual did not pose an imminent threat? The second time, the Attorney General said, I don't believe it would be appropriate. Yet a third time, I asked the Attorney General, I am not asking about appropriateness. As the Attorney General of the United States, you're the chief legal officer for this nation. Does the Department of Justice have a legal opinion as to whether it is constitutional for the U.S. government to kill a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil if he or she does not pose an imminent threat? And yet a third time the answer was it wouldn't be appropriate. And then finally, when asked a fourth time, the Attorney General said, when I say appropriate, I mean it wouldn't be unconstitutional. And so finally, after asking 4 times, the Attorney General agreed. And my response in that questioning was, General Holder, I'm very glad you have stated that position. I emphatically agree with that position. I don't understand why it took such gymnastics to get to that position. I wish you had simply said that in response to Senator Paul now 2 days ago. It would have been a very straightforward and simple thing to say. And what I also said to the Attorney General is that Senator Paul and I have drafted legislation that will make explicitly clear that the U.S. government may not kill a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil who does not pose an imminent threat. And I hope, based on the Attorney General's representations, that the Department will support that legislation. That ought, in my judgment, be legislation that should be bipartisan legislation that should pass this body 100-0, because it is truly phrased with as unobjectionable a legal truism as I can come up with. I will admit I have been flabbergasted as these days have gone on. Why John Brennan, when asked by Senator Paul this question, did not simply say no. Why Eric Holder, when asked repeatedly, did not simply say no, at least not at first. And why in the now over 12 hours that this filibuster has proceeded, the White House has not put in writing the absolutely correct statement of constitutional law that the federal government cannot kill U.S. citizens on U.S. soil if they do not pose imminent threats. And I would note, with the hypothetical that the senator from Illinois posed to Senator Paul, even in that situation, Osama bin Laden was a horrible enemy of the United States who committed a grievous act of terror and was the mastermind behind it. And I am very glad that after a decade-long manhunt, we were able to find him. And we were able to, in a military battlefield, take him out. I would suggest the question, if he were not in Pakistan, if he were living in an apartment in the suburbs of Chicago, and if he were asleep in bed, I would suggest that even if he were Osama bin Laden, a really, really, really bad guy, there is nothing in the Constitution that gives the federal government the authority to fire a missile at an apartment with a sleeping person in it in the United States of America if that individual was a U.S. citizen. And if he were in the U.S., what we would do is what we would expect to do with any other really, really, really bad guy, which is go in and apprehend him. Now, behind enemy lines, you can't always do that. There are things that happen on the battlefield that we would never do here at home. And so I would suggest that any argument that says that someone sleeping at home in bed presents an imminent threat is an argument that stretches the bounds of the word imminence beyond where its natural meaning should lie. If an individual is pointing a bazooka at the Pentagon, or robbing a bank, or committing another crime of violence, there is no doubt that force and lethal force can be used to stop that crime of violence. But I think there likewise should be no doubt that the federal government lacks the authority to kill United States citizens on U.S. soil if there is no imminent threat of death or grievous bodily harm. And so I am hopeful that the result of this extended discussion will be severalfold. I am hopeful, number one, that it will prompt the White House to do what the White House has heretofore refused to do, which is in writing explicitly answer the question posed by Senator Paul now over a week ago, and explicitly state as the position of the United States of America that the federal government cannot kill a United States citizen on U.S. soil if that individual does not pose an imminent threat of death or grievous bodily harm. I also hope that a consequence of this extended discussion is that we will find widespread agreement in this body behind passing legislation to make clear that the Constitution does not allow such killings. I am hopeful that that legislation will command wide support on the Republican side of the aisle, but likewise wide support on the Democrat side of the aisle. I would hope and would certainly welcome the support of the senior senator from Illinois, and indeed every member of the Democratic caucus. And should this body come together in a bipartisan way, or even better, in a unanimous manner, and clarify that the Constitution prohibits killing U.S. citizens on U.S. soil absent an immediate threat, I would suggest this debate would have accomplished a great deal, because it would have made clear the limits of the executive power, and it would be indeed carrying out the finest traditions of this body, serving as a check to unchecked government power. And so I would ask of the senator from Kentucky, do you agree, if those were the outcomes of this proceedings, that this would indeed have been a beneficial proceeding for helping focus the American people on these issues and helping draw a line that the executive cannot cross consistent with the Constitution?
Mr. President, I am hopeful that we have drawn attention to this issue, that this issue won't fade away, that the President will tomorrow come up with a response. I would like nothing more than to facilitate the voting and the continuation of the debate tomorrow. I hope the President will respond to us. We've tried repeatedly throughout the day, and we'll see what the outcome of that is. I would like to thank my staff for being here for a long day, for their help. I'd like to thank the fellow senators for being supportive of this cause. I would like to thank the members of Congress who came over to support this cause, the clerks, the Capitol Police, the staff of the Senate, the doorkeepers who apparently I may have gotten in trouble, and anybody else who came to support this, and even the senior senator from Illinois, for better or worse, for being here to support the cause. The cause here is one that I think is important enough to have gone through this procedure. I sit at Henry Clay's desk, and they call Henry Clay the great compromiser. When I came to Washington, one of my fellow senators said to me, he said, "Oh, I guess you'll be the great compromiser." And I kind of smiled at him and laughed, and I learned a little bit about Henry Clay and his career. And you know, people think that some of us won't compromise. There are many compromises. There are many things I'm willing to split the difference on. If the Democrats will ever come to us and say we will save Social Security, what the age we change it to, how fast we do, there are a lot of things we can split the difference on. But the issue we've had today, I think, is one that we don't split the difference on. I think you don't get half the Fifth Amendment. I don't think you acknowledge the President can obey the Fifth Amendment when he chooses. I don't think you acknowledge the Fifth Amendment due process can somehow occur behind closed doors. So while I'm a fan of Henry Clay, I've often said that I'm a fan of Cassius Clay. Cassius Clay's weapons of choice were said to be his pen and his Bowie knife. He was said to be so good with the first that he often had recourse to the latter. He was a fierce abolitionist. He didn't suffer fools, and he didn't compromise often. But what I would say is, it is worth fighting for what you believe in. I think the American people can tolerate a debate and a discussion. There's been nothing mean-spirited about this debate for 12 hours. I think, in fact, more of it would be even better. I wish we had more open and enjoined debate. The senior senator from Illinois has brought up good points, and I think that there is much discussion. I just hope that this won't be swept under the rug, and that this isn't the end of this, but that this is the beginning of this. And I would go for another 12 hours to try to break Strom Thurmond's record, but I've discovered that there are some limits to filibustering, and I'm going to have to go take care of one of those in a few minutes here. But I do appreciate the Senate's forbearance in this, and I hope that if there are some on the other side of the aisle who have been listening and feel that they may agree on some of these issues, that if they will use their ability to impact the President's decision, and one will say that the Senate should be trying to restrain the executive branch, Republican or Democrat, and two, will use your influence to try to tell the President to do what I think really is in his heart, and that is to say, absolutely, we're not going to be killing Americans not in a combat situation, that we will obey the Constitution, that the Fifth Amendment does apply to all Americans, and there aren't exceptions. But I thank you very much for the forbearance, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois. There will be order. There will be order. Expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted in the Senate. Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, let me first say, on a personal note, I want to thank the Senator from Kentucky. He and I have agreed on many things and worked together on many things, and there's much common agreement on what we hope to achieve with this issue, as important as it is. And I thank him for his spirited defense of his position today and 12 hours, and I want to excuse him from the floor whenever he wishes. I move to proceed to the consideration of calendar number 43.
The question is on the measure to proceed. Without objection, the motion is agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Central Intelligence Agency, John Owen Brennan of Virginia, to be Director.
Mr. President, I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the motion.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of John Owen Brennan of Virginia to be Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, signed by 17 senators as follows: Reed of Nevada, Feinstein, Rockefeller, Stabenow, Brown, Reed of Rhode Island, Cardin, Carper, Coons, Casey, Pryor, Nelson, Beckidge, Mikulski, Murray, Levin, and Manchin.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate resume legislative session and proceed to a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection, so ordered.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business, it adjourn until 10 a.m. on Thursday, March the 7th, 2013, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the journal of proceedings be approved to date, the time of the two leaders be reserved for their use later in the day, and that following any leader remarks, the Senate resume executive session in consideration of the Brennan nomination. Further, that the Senate recess from 12:30 p.m. until 2 p.m. to allow for caucus meetings.
Without objection, so ordered.
If there's no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it adjourn under the previous order.